Welcome, everybody. I'm Mary Fitzgerald, the editor-in-chief of openDemocracy. I'm broadcasting to you from the ground, literally. I'm in a rental car just outside of Philadelphia today to talk about the unfolding situation in the United States. We have Aditi Juneja, who joins us from Protect Democracy. And I believe you're dialing in from Washington, Aditi, is that correct?
No, I'm actually also in Pennsylvania.
Oh, you're in Pennsylvania too. Okay, fantastic. And we have Mona Eltahawy, who's joining us from New York, I believe. And I just a dynamic conversation. Please do add any thoughts, questions to the chat, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. And I wanted to start with Aditi because you and your organization Protect Democracy are, I assume, right in the trenches right now. Can you explain to us what you're doing, what Protect Democracy does? You find yourself in?
Sure. So Protect Democracy was founded in 2017 with the mission of preventing the United States from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. And since then, we have built out a bunch of different tools that we use, including lawsuits, advocacy, both state and federal, legislative advocacy, and communications work. I think so we've been doing all of that work for the last several years, and starting in 2019, we helped convene the National Task Force on Election Crises, which includes 50 members from across the political aisle, folks like Vanita Gupta and Sherrilyn Ifill, who lead civil rights organizations in the United States, as well as people who've served in Republican administrations, like former Homeland Secretary Michael Chertoff and the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, Michael Steele. And the idea was to bring this group of people together to opine collectively on what does it look like to have a free and fair election, and to do that work and prepare for disaster scenarios before the election. And so we've been doing that work for the last several years. And one of the things that we learned was the narrative set in the first 24 hours after the election is crucially important. So yesterday we hosted a press briefing. We did a briefing with a bunch of celebrities and influencers and really tried to help them understand what is going on right now in the United States. And that is that because of the large influx of mail-in voting due to the coronavirus, we are in the process of still counting many ballots. There were states, Florida, Arizona, and Texas, that have laws that allow that counting and processing to happen before Election Day. However, 3 of our swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, have not allowed for that counting to happen before Election Day. So in those states, election officials started counting just yesterday, and that is why it is taking some time. And so we are urging calm and patience, and that is what I've been telling people for the last 24 and 48 hours, including myself. And I'm sure folks abroad and others have had sort of the jarring experience, even if you've been prepared and are well-informed, that you're like, it's happening, it's really happening. So I think that we're all dealing with our emotions as we are, despite being very well prepared, and this going about as well as it could have possibly gone, given the circumstances.
So I wanted to ask you some of the legal pathways here, because of course we're hearing that the president will be challenging the results and is vowing to fight many of these issues in the courts. But of what this looks like and how far indeed he can challenge based on the situation as you see it right now, and what needs to happen in response.
So there are challenges that happen that are quite normal in every election. Recounts, for example, in very close elections, the president's team has requested a recount in Wisconsin. But of course, recounts are just literally recounting the votes. So if you've lost an election by 20,000 or 30,000 votes, counting them again is just going to confirm that answer. Recounts only really change results of elections when you're talking about a margin of a couple hundred votes where you might have gotten it wrong, and that's not the situation we're in. Also, the president is making efforts to try to stop counting votes, and that was one of the post-election scenarios that we were worried about, or we were looking out for. And there's just no legal basis to stop counting votes writ large, period. There are technicalities, and the laws are different in every state on which ballots can be counted in terms of when they are received. It is complicated and unnecessarily so, which is a different conversation for a different day. But when the postmark deadlines affect when ballots can be counted, so when did you actually mail the ballot in? When was it received? So all of those issues are being worked out in court, but the president can't just decide that he doesn't want certain ballots counted. That is not a thing. And we have laws, we have equal protection laws, we have due process laws that require the laws that were in place before the election to be followed, and also to ensure that the way votes are counted across different counties in a state are similar. And so some of those challenges are being fought, but we don't expect them to be outcome determinative.
Okay, thank you. So you win this presidency, and that the
I'm so sorry.
is down.
Mary, I'm having a hard time hearing you. You're cutting in and out.
More of a chance. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So you are having, so the picture that you've painted is broadly positive. It's cautious, but it's broadly optimistic that Biden is going to win the White House, that there will be distractions and sound and fury. It's clear at this stage that he has that would be correct.
I'm sorry, I heard up to sound and fury and then you cut out again.
Okay, I was just going to ask, it seems clear to you at this stage on present evidence that he has a mandate.
Yes, absolutely. Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States, but we have to wait till every vote is counted and those results are certified. And there may be attempts to challenge that result, but the will of the people in our democracy will be followed and executed ultimately, although there may be some challenges as we're getting there.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, so in that case, let's move on in this discussion to what do we think this result means? And Mona, I think one of the interesting questions that came from some of our participants so far was, does this result show declining
Okay, Mary, you're cutting out again, so it must be your connection. But I do remember this question because we talked about it before we went live. So for everyone watching, Mary, I believe, is asking me, does this result mean a decline in support for patriarchy? And I'm delighted to get this question because the way I begin all my discussions everywhere, online and offline, before, during, and after elections is, hello, everyone. This is Mona Eltahawy. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and my declaration of faith is fuck the patriarchy. And what is happening in the United States now is most certainly absolutely not a sign that patriarchy is declining or that people are saying fuck the patriarchy in the way that I want them to. What is happening in the United States is a fucking disaster when it comes to the patriarchy, because after 4 years of president grab them by the pussy and a year in which thousands of people have died because a president grabbed them by the pussy's criminal neglect, and a year in which we have seen an incredible revolution of Black resistance against systemic violence, about 70 million Americans have chosen President grab them by the pussy. And even if Joe Biden, as Aditi has told us, is declared the next president of the United States, those 70 million people are not going anywhere, i.e. patriarchy is not going anywhere. But I want to remind people that Donald Trump is not the only symbol of patriarchy in the United States today. Patriarchy runs deep in the United States, and it's especially deep now because Trump might be leaving and he won't occupy the White House anymore, but you know who is here and you know who the real winner is. The real winner is the conservative Christian Christian white evangelical movement in the United States that has been working for this since the early 1970s. They have a majority in the Supreme Court. Trump nominated successfully 3 Supreme Court justices. So there is a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. The Republicans have maintained their majority in the Senate and have increased the number of seats they have in the House. So the winner there is Mitch McConnell, which means the winner is patriarchy, which means we must continue saying fuck the patriarchy. This does not mean just because President grabbed them by the pussy is gone, that the patriarchy is gone. And I want to remind people that when we do talk about the grab them by the pussy, i.e. misogyny, I am not a white woman. I am a woman of Muslim descent, who is a woman of color, who is an anarchist feminist, who does not buy this liberal feminism business of, oh, thank goodness my country is back. No, it is not, because which country are you talking about? So just to finalize what I'm saying with this pussy metaphor again, all pussies might be equal, but some pussies are more equal than others. So let's talk about women of color. Let's talk about trans women. Let's talk about people who are not included in the white liberal feminist definition of we are getting rid of patriarchy, because conservatism is winning in the United States. We are on the threshold of a theocracy, and the fight that we had in the run-up to this election has to continue. Any white American watching this, who for the past 4 years has been whining about, oh my God, this isn't my America, and who now begins to say, my America is back or my country is back, I want nothing to do with them. The fight must continue because Donald Trump was a useful idiot who delivered to the conservatives what they want. This is the fight ahead.
Thank you so much, Mona. And that leads me very quickly onto what I wanted to ask Paul, and indeed what people have already been asking in the chat. Paul, you made the point that nearly 70 million Americans backed Donald Trump. That's something we didn't know before this vote.
I'm not hearing you now, Mary.
70 million Americans backed Trump. We didn't know this before the vote.
Agreed. And here's what I think it means. Obviously, what we haven't yet seen are detailed breakdowns of the swings. But the New York Times map shows that there's been a polarization in both directions. It has these arrow maps, and you can see even in places like Oregon or even Utah, swings to blue, and then throughout a whole swathe from Oklahoma right up to Iowa, you've got swings to red. So you've had a polarized electorate, and 70 million people voted for what they now know to be Trumpism. Last time it was, is the guy serious? What's he going to do? There was a theory, the establishment will keep him under control. None of that happened. What I think this means, I mean, it means some big things. It means, my explanation for it is, the number one thing that has happened there is white fear over Black Lives Matter. You can see it when we in the UK, we hear vox pops from Florida. You know, we're quite well served by journalists who know where to go and speak to people. You've been doing it yourself, Mary. It's not just the Cuban exiles in Miami. There was clearly a white fear of BLM. There was a Hispanic redefinition as white. I think that's going on. And I think that the other thing is its middle class fear of socialism. I think the third factor that led to this was the absolute vacuity of Joe Biden's campaign, terrible campaign choices, and no strategy. I don't think the Democratic National Committee had a strategy for winning this election. I don't think it has a strategy for government, and I don't think it has a strategy for the 21st century. So the left and liberalism in America are in crisis. If you look at the way I read this is what we now see American politics. It's reached its destination since the Southern strategy began in the 70s of the Republicans. We've now got basically a sectarian headcount. We're well used to that in the United Kingdom because we have the province of Northern Ireland, which is a straightforward religious conflict. All elections there are how many Catholics vote versus how many Protestants vote, by and large. This is going to be how many progressives versus how many racists and violent misogynists. And I'm afraid that's going to be the next election as well. So I think this throws into crisis the strategy of almost every player. It certainly throws into crisis the strategy of all those liberal professors who say, just get in power, tweak the constitution, obey the norms, go to the same country clubs again, treat each other as friends. That's gone. I think the left strategy, class reductionism should be out of the window. The idea that, we're going to reconnect over economic issues. They're not interested in economic issues, I'm afraid. They're interested, they tick the box, I'm worried about the economy, because what that means is I support Donald Trump. What they're worried about is black people claiming the right not to be killed and women claiming the right not to be raped and harassed online. So I think that I know it's early and everyone's still waiting for the big thing, but the sooner the Democratic establishment gets its head around that the world is over, that it thought it was trying to win in, I think the better.
Thank you so much. I wanted to respond to what both of you have said, and then I have a follow-up question actually to ask her.
Hi, everybody. Because Mary's having trouble with her connection, I'm going to ask the question instead. We've got a question from Anthony Barnett, who founded Open Democracy in 2000, saying he's followed a lot of the fantastic work being done to convince people to vote, however weak Biden might seem, and to make their voice heard. But he says he hasn't seen work or organizing dedicated to long-term convincing Trump voters to change their mind. Question is, why is this? And I'm going to ask Aditi to address that one first.
Yeah, I think that both Paul and Mona's comments are precisely on Trump is a symptom of a broader problem. He is not the problem himself. And I think that as Protect Democracy was founded and thinking about it, we also connect the rise of authoritarianism and fascism in the United States to that is happening around the world. That is not unique in the United States. And we've really tried to learn lessons from what has happened in other countries. I think that there have been efforts to do organizing and outreach to Trump voters. In 2016, 2017, I was one of the early organizers. I was working on Resistance Manual then. It was a year before I joined Protect Democracy. And there were efforts, knock every door. There were groups, there was People's Supper. There were groups that were really trying to think about relational organizing, building conversations, building communities with Trump voters. And the challenge is when you reach your hand out, you need the person to reach their hand back. And it doesn't work if you try to go into a community and have a conversation with someone who doesn't want to have a conversation with you. And additionally, in the United States, I think a part of the challenge is that we live we don't live in community with one another. Our politics also kind of map onto where we live. And so it's hard to, it doesn't work for me to go into rural Kansas and be like, hey, I'm here now. Do people want to talk to me? That's not a thing. You need to talk to people who you are in community with. And so the way we live in, that is historic. That is not, that is the result of segregation and government enforced policies. That is not just a decision by coastal elites to live on the coast. That narrative I think is also false. But there were early efforts at that type of organizing and outreach. And I think that one, organizing is always poorly funded. And the second is that it is just hard to do outreach to people who don't want to be reached out to.
Thanks, Aditi. Mona, what do you think about this question?
Well, I think this question at its heart is one of the biggest problems in the United States. So when Donald Trump was elected, and again, Donald Trump is this symptom. He's not an aberration by any stretch of the imagination. We heard all of this talk about how, oh, don't call racists racist because that's going to end the conversation. Or, oh, be civil when you talk about how fucking outrageous it is that American voters voted for a fascist and a white supremacist. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, you know what? I'm a woman, cisgender, yes, but a woman of Muslim descent who recognizes the viciousness and the violence of this vote for a fascist and a white supremacist. And I'm looking across this country where I've lived for 20 years now. There are children and their families in cages, in concentration camps at the border. There is a Muslim ban. There Black people, men and women, trans, cis, everything, are killed by the police with impunity. And there is no fucking way, and I'm saying this underlined, there is no fucking way I'm interested in stretching across any aisle. I think the biggest problem with American politics is, first of all, that's white people's responsibility. That's not my responsibility. And then when and if white people who are not white supremacists or fascists are elected, i.e. Democrats, this is what the Democrats, liberal Democrats, I'm a leftist, I'm not a liberal, how liberal Democrats like to think of themselves. This is what happens. They do all of this reach out across the aisle. We've got to be civil. We need unity. And then when the Republicans are elected, they don't give a flying fuck about civility and unity. They're like, we won this. Even with the narrowest of victories, they own it, they claim it. They don't want to know what we think. So I am sick and tired. And I'm saying this, and I don't care that Joe Biden will be president, because my fight continues, because I don't think that Joe Biden becoming president is going to solve this. I want Trump voters to understand that where they stand is socially unacceptable. It is socially unacceptable to vote for a fascist. It is socially unacceptable to vote for a white supremacist, and I don't care what excuse they use. So I'm not interested in converting them. This is white people's problems. I am interested in surviving. I am not interested in talking to someone who doesn't recognize my full humanity. And this burden is placed on Black people. This burden is placed on people of color. We're constantly told, trust Black women. Black women will save us. Black women should not be the ones who save us. This is white people. This is the problem of white people. This is white people's failure, liberal and conservative. And we, people of color, are constantly asked to step into the gap, to be the bigger people, be civil. No, I will call a racist, because that's what they are. Anybody who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2020 is a white supremacist and a fascist enabler. So that's not my job. My job is on white people. Go and do your business, because we are trying to survive here. That's my answer to that question.
Okay, Mona getting a virtual round of applause in the chat there for that. Paul, what are you going to say?
Well, I think that that's the situation. I mean, Brecht once said, didn't he, when the East German government said they'd lost confidence in the people of East Germany, Brecht said, well, you can't dissolve the people and elect a new one. And those of us on the left are going to have to live with the fact that there are 70 million knowing, I wouldn't call them fascists, but some of them are. There are 70 million knowing, xenophobic, radical, misogynist, racists. They do know. I mean, that's the shocking thing about last night and the night before, that we must allow to sink in. Now, what's the problem there? The problem that everybody now has, the first thing is and we're still in this world, that liberalism has spent the last 4 years doing what? Kicking the left. That's what it's been doing. I think the left, as well, as I intimated before, doesn't understand the problem. There is a good part of the left, you know, from Michael Moore through to the so-called dirtbag bloggers and podcasters, that thinks this can be solved by economic appeal. If you read Wilhelm Reich, the German psychiatrist, during the rise of fascism in the Weimar Republic, Reich said, look, what we did wrong, the communists would hire a stadium and they'd read out economic statistics to a bunch of unemployed people who knew they were unemployed. And the next night, the Germans would hire the same stadium, same kind of crowd, and they just shout blood, honor, land, you know, the rest. We need to break that block. It's not done purely through appeals to economic solidarity. And I think it's got to be done by being honest about who they are. But I mean, it's almost like worth throwing open to people who are living and breathing that. What does that mean where it can happen? Is there any single place in the United States that we think that did happen? Or look, there's been a lot of criticism, for example, from the Democrats for spending money with the Lincoln Project. I'm not so critical of that, because it's a dialogue, isn't it? It's an attempt to talk to so-called moderate Republicans. Now, I don't know yet whether there was so many moderate Republicans. It doesn't look like there were. It may be that there were a lot of moderate, not involved people. And remember, the right always mobilizes new people. That's what you can do if you've got Fox News, you've got the Daily Wire, you've got these amplification of lie machine. You can do that. So I think that if I was sitting there with the strategists of, say, the Squad or the DSA, Black Lives Matter, I would say we need a strategy function here. We need to actually put on the table the problem that in 2024, it won't be Trump, it'll be Tom Cotton or this Hawley guy. So much more suited, and then the real tragedy will be, and the real mind bender will be if they find a vice presidential candidate who is an evangelical Hispanic with a populist touch. You've got to be starting now to say what kind of person beats Tom Cotton and somebody from the streets, because then you'll see Wall Street come back, you'll see Hollywood come back. These Hollywood and Wall Street are not full of progressive people, and then you are looking. Well, two things. What are the results? You're looking at authoritarianism forever, and you're looking at American decline, institutionalized. And if you want an authoritarian, declining, semi-dictatorship, fine, go ahead. But if you don't, I think this is a moment where, if we read back to the mid-60s, where the civil rights movement, the left of the Democrats, Malcolm X, that moment around Selma, when the Voting Rights Act is written and rushed through Congress, you've got to be prepared to do something like that. But I don't know what that is.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to make an attempt here, and I'll go back to Aditi after this. But just to reflect what I've been seeing and hearing on the ground for the past few weeks, I've met almost no Trump voters who voted Trump in 2016 who are now not voting for Trump. But I have met a lot of what you would expect to be Biden voters, Black Lives Matter activists, Hispanic business owners who haven't voted, who did not vote for Biden because they felt as though he and that platform did not represent them. So I wanted to take this question back to Aditi, because Paul's thrown this forward, right? He said what happens in 2024, and I'd love to hear that from your perspective. What do you see happening over the next few years, and particularly, what do you think is the answer of the right if Trump narrowly loses? One of our audience members asked, where does the alt-right go from here? So I think both, where does that kind of alt-right Trumpist movement go, and what do you see playing out over the next few years if we think the result is confirmed that Biden wins?
So I think, as both Mona and Paul rightfully pointed out, the alt-right and Trumpism is not new. Racism has existed in the United States always. Trump, I think, gave it a newfound legitimacy. I also think that all of us can kind of point to moments of anecdotal data, but I think an important thing to name is that we had historic voter turnout this election. So we had more people show up in this election than showed up in 2016 and showed up in 2008. And so people are voting, people are mobilized, people were engaged this election cycle in the midst of a global pandemic. And so I think that is something to name and to celebrate. I think that the alt-right, and really it's not just the alt-right, but the right generally, doesn't know what its path forward is after Trump. And that is something that they're going to have to figure out. The Republican Party has built a coalition that is shrinking. It is not really a coalition. It is largely white voters. The Republican Party, I saw a statistic today saying that the Republican Party will have more QAnon supporters in Congress in 2021 than Black Republicans. And so the majority is their coalition is just not going to exist going forward. The country is changing. And so folks may remember post 2008, the Republican Party did an autopsy report where they kind of analyzed what they need to do in order to have a winning strategy going forward. And the answer to that was that they need to be less racist. They need to be more inclusive. And that is not what they chose to do in 2016. And so I think the answer to what the Republican Party as an establishment party, and then what the alt-right, which is separate and a movement, and of course there is overlap, chooses to do. I don't think there's an answer that we know right now. I think what we do know, though, is that Donald Trump exposed flaws and holes in our system, in our political system, and in our government. So I think one of the most common questions I've gotten over the last 4 years is, can he do that? And there's a lot of the way that American democracy functions and operates that was governed by norms and not by laws. And I think that just as post-Watergate, post-Nixon, there was a push for reform. I think we were going to see something very similar post-Trump presidency and a Biden administration. There was a package of reforms, 3 actually introduced this past year. There's the Protecting Our Democracy Act, HR 1 and HR 4, which both looks to codify norms into law, but also restore voting rights and make democracy more inclusive and accessible to people. And I think that we're going to see a wave of that type of reform in a Biden administration. I'd also just add that I think that Paul is right, that people are not going away, people are here. And so the question, like, you're not gonna, half the country is not gonna disappear. And so, and I don't know if I would say that half of the country, the half of the country that voted for Donald Trump are all fascist and racist, but they certainly don't seem to mind voting for one. And so that remains with us, and more people voted for Donald Trump this election than voted for him in 2016. And so that also remains a reality that we're all going to have to contend with. And I agree with Mona, it is not the responsibility of those who are most marginalized and oppressed to be reaching out to convince people of their humanity, but our current our current state of being does not work. We are hyperpolarized, and we are polarized not just across political divisions and ideology, but our information ecosystems are hyperpolarized. As people start reading and processing information, they're just living in different realities of what they think is happening in the world. And if you thought there was a ring of pedophiles at the highest levels of government, you would be scared too. And so I think that our information divide is a huge problem that is contributing to a lot of the polarization. I know I said a lot of stuff there, so I'll pause there, but
thank you.
So much going on.
That is great. And I want to ask you another question. I mean, on the ring of pedophiles and the QAnon thing, it's interesting because it can often be much more subtle or insidious than that. I mean, I met a guy in rural Kentucky who absolutely does not think that Biden is part of a cabal of pedophiles. But when I asked him, why are you supporting Trump? His top reason was human trafficking. He said, this president has done more on human trafficking than any president ever. And as a father, I really care about that. That's something that means a lot to me. So, you know, he was definitely not hardcore QAnon all the way gone, but his top reason was human trafficking, and he was part of that Save the Children Facebook group that got shut down. So yeah, it's insidious. Our information systems frame our perspectives in all kinds of insidious ways, and across the spectrum. I wanted to ask you another question, Aditi, because you said that obviously a Biden administration would pass laws to better protect and codify American democracy. But do they have the mandate for that? I mean, they won't have the Senate, or they may have the Senate in January if they're lucky, but it'd be very, very tight and very close. What do you think is possible? And also, what do you think is most important? Because yes, it's much, the questions and the issues we're talking about here are far broader than can only be protected or enshrined in law. But that is also a really important component of that. So what's possible, and what do you think is most important?
So, the great thing about democracy is what is possible is what we make possible. And so it is not, we live in a political reality, but that political reality is temporal, and that political reality can be shifted and changed. I think that Joe Biden, when it's all said and done, would have won this election by 5 million votes, and he will be the president. He will absolutely have a mandate. Donald Trump won the election, lost the popular vote, and had 2 to 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, and he governed as though he had a mandate. I don't think that there's any I think, on the left, there can sometimes be a challenge of taking yes for an answer, and yes, if Joe Biden wins, he would have won and should act like it. And I agree and deeply feel those who wanted to see a repudiation of a racist, misogynistic, authoritarian president. That's not what happened. But Joe Biden still won. It is very unusual for an incumbent president not to win re-election. I think it's happened once in modern history with Jimmy Carter, and I just want to name that, because I think it's not just because it's not as big of a victory or it's not as big of a repudiation as you would like does not mean that there's not something happening. And so I think that in terms of priorities, that is for the Biden administration to decide. Like, I can't decide what their priorities are from my perspective, where I sit. I think democracy reform is kind of at the basis of everything else. If our democracy is not functioning, then any of the policy issues that affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis don't work, and our representative government doesn't function. And I think we've all been experiencing that increasingly over the course of our lifetimes. I just add that, you know, government never leads, people lead, organizers lead, people bring what they want to government's door and government follows. Joe Biden has been at the center of his party for the last 30 to 40 years as that party has changed. So, you know, government elected officials, they follow the will of the people, and it is the work of organizers and people on the ground who are in communities, shifting the Overton window, changing what people believe is possible, what people are interested in, what they care about. That is important. To your point about the voter in Kentucky, I think like that's just illustrative of that. The right-wing media and that media ecosystem often ends up shaping mainstream media narratives. And so one of the things I think I'm going to be most interested in post-election is kind of thinking about this polarization and this divide. And a large part of that is going to be our information ecosystems. The most important election administration official this election cycle, and people that the folks that on the National Task Force on Election Crises were really focused on reaching out to, were the social media companies. Mark Zuckerberg a disproportionate amount of power in every election that happens around the world, and no one voted for him, and no one can vote him out, and that is a problem. So I think that regulation of tech, kind of thinking about the way tech works with our democracy and how it impacts our democracy, is going to be really important, because we have a public square. It's just happening online. I know Mona from Twitter. Like, that is what that's the place we interact. And you know, Jack Dorsey shouldn't decide how Mona and I interact. That's weird. Like, we need to have more of a say as a democracy, as a people, in the way that we are governed and communicate with each other, and make sure we have a shared information ecosystem so we can disagree, but we're disagreeing off of a shared set of facts.
Thank you. I wanted to bring in Paul here. Paul, obviously you're a very experienced journalist, so I wanted you to pick up the point about information ecosystem, because obviously we need free speech, we need media plurality, diversity, we need a healthy and vibrant fourth estate, and we need regulation of the public square that social media has become. So yeah, just pick up any of those points that you'd like to.
I think while it is true, I mean, look, what we know, and it's true of COVID, it's true of Antifa, all of that stuff. The ecosystem works like this. There are the people who place false information, and then there are the people who amplify it. So that's Fox, Daily Wire, etc., Breitbart, and then there are sort of willing accomplices in the mainstream. So, you know, even people, to be honest, even the mainstream, quite liberal American media, you know, is Antifa really terrorist? Let's find out. You know, that kind of stuff. You can stop that if you stop the origin. And the traffic to the origin is low. What has boomed in 2020 is the traffic to the amplifiers. I mean, their traffic is up something like 250% during the COVID epidemic, and they are the big amplifiers of QAnon and the rest. So I've been reading recently the work of Karl Loewenstein, who Americans will know from as a 1950s jurist, but was a German Jew in the 1930s. And he wrote this article called Militant Democracy, where he says to the liberal, the liberal elite of his day, fascism is coming for you. And if you don't want to make alliances with the left, which you clearly don't want to, sometimes they did in the Popular Front era, you've got to get militant about the democracy you're defending. Now, I thought Loewenstein more or less designed the German constitution, the post-war German constitution. And what he says is, look, you know, if there are people in uniforms marching around in guns, arrest them. If they open fire, shoot them. That's what we call that's what stopped Hitler's beer hall push. Some very conservative Bavarian policemen shot the Nazis. Now, I know this sounds awful to people, but in the end, it's whether it applies to the Second Amendment, whether it applies to the First Amendment, that is to the media, to guns, to registration of parties, to registration of organizations and websites. There's a nice way of doing it, which is you mobilize the left the minorities, the working class, and the liberal elite, and you form a narrative, a story, an offer to the American people that mobilizes people who didn't vote last night. But if you don't want to do that, I say this again to the Democratic establishment, then you've got to get serious about defending the rule of law. And I would start with all, there's nothing that, even under Constitution, there's nothing that says you have to be able to spread hate speech. There's nothing that says that you should be allowed to do that. And I do feel that American constitutional, especially now we've got all the originalists in the Supreme Court, the American Constitution is a time bomb in the 21st century. And it will, as it currently stands, it will not allow even the quite bourgeois elitists to defend a basic rule of law and even state monopoly of force. It's not allowing that. So I don't know. It's quite interesting when you read liberal jurists and law professors in America. They hate Loewenstein. They hate the idea that a state might have to be quite authoritarian to defend its democratic basis.
Thank you. I want to come back to Aditi on this, but I wanted to ask Mona quickly about information ecosystems. You are definitely a Twitter influencer. You've seen the power of social media to affect change and to affect progressive change. And indeed, many of us years ago were quite excited by this. So yes, pick up the information ecosystem point, however you'd like to, Mona.
Well, I come from a background in journalism. For 10 years in the Middle East and North Africa, I was a correspondent for Reuters news agency in Cairo and Jerusalem. And then I was a contributor to The Guardian from Cairo. So I've done the whole journalism thing. And having done it, and I no longer do news reporting, I tell you my opinion. I tell you where I stand. I also understand that one of the weaknesses of so-called mainstream journalism is that it is dominated by whiteness, white men mostly, and many more white women than women of color. It is out of touch with so many of the people who are directly hurt by what is constantly elected over and over in the United States. We saw this, when Black Lives Matter, this incredible revolution that, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, we saw how out of touch so many newsrooms were with how Black people feel and what their lives are like, with so many other things, with the reporting about what's happening on the border. So basically, this is my way of saying that I use social media to actually say what I think. And I say it from the left. I am no longer polite. I am no longer pretending that something called objectivity exists. I am sick and tired of the New York Times. How long did it take mainstream media in the United States, even the so-called, legitimate, mainstream, believable, not the derangement of Fox News? How long did it take NPR and the New York Times to actually say in a headline, President Trump is lying? They couldn't even use the word lying. They couldn't even use the word racist. They would not use language that for so many of us was the reality of our lives. So this is how I use my social media now. You come to my social media and Mona's gonna say, fuck the patriarchy. You come to my social media and Mona's gonna say, President fascist, fuck Trump. Because I am sick and tired of being bound by codes of civility and unity that the American mainstream media is still bound by in a very uncivil and very ununified time. So that's what I do with my social media. Now, I agree with Aditi and Paul both about the dangers that we're seeing happening with Facebook and the incredible unchecked power of Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey. I totally agree. But I also think that social media is real life. It's not, people say the virtual world, it's just as real as IRL and the real world. What you seek online is what you seek in the so-called real world. It is just as real. So who are you? It effectively is about the kind of person you are and the ideology that you have. Facebook didn't create fascism. It gave them a platform to find each other. Just as television didn't create whatever it was said to have created. It is who I am and it is who you are and it is who the Fox viewer is. And they go to where they find this shit is. And it's the sewer, So who are we and what is there that gives us what we need? So you come to my Twitter and this is what you're going to get. You go to Fox News and it's going to be. So who are you? Because at the end of the day, it's about the kind of person you are. Are you a fascist enabler? Because if you are, you know where to go. Are you going to fight fascism? Come to me and others. That's where I stand on social media.
Thank you very much, Mona. I wanted to pick that up. It's interesting, actually, because I've been watching more Fox News than I have done in a very, very long time, being here in the States. There are a few interesting things that I picked up. The first is that they are the first, and I believe it's now the only station to have called Arizona for Biden. They may be the first station to call the fact that Trump has officially lost. There's a fascinating discussion we can get about that. They've been very clear that American voters have rejected Trump, but they haven't rejected Republicans. So you can already see the pivot in terms of the commentary and the analysis. And I take your point absolutely about all your points, Mona, about social media. On the other hand, what we're undoubtedly seeing is algorithms reinforcing our filter bubbles or echo chambers in ways which, yes, they reflect who we are, they reflect our worldview, they reflect our opinion, but they shut out any understanding or connection with or perspective from anyone who feels differently and is differently from us. And I think that's dangerous and that's toxic, and that's something that tech has accelerated at an unprecedented speed this generation, and that we don't fully even understand the consequences of that. We're going to have to look back and understand that better. So, and I also think about that as we're just heading to Philadelphia today, and you listen to and hear people who are describing radically different realities about what's happening with vote counts, what's happening in certain states, what's really fundamentally happening with democracy at this moment. So Aditi, I wanted to come to you and ask you, are you concerned about those things as well? And also, quite specifically, I know you've given us hope and you've encouraged us to be calm and be confident. But on the other hand, what specifically do you see happening and playing out in the next critical few days and weeks?
So in the next few days, I expect that we will have the race called. I think that either today or tomorrow, Joe Biden will have won the election, and that you will start to see a coalescing around that. I think the question then will be how Trump responds and what he chooses to do next. And I think that we don't know the answer to that. I think what we do know is that people don't like being associated with a loser. And I think you're already starting to see Republicans flee him, and those that had supported and propped him up leave him, or at the very least remain silent. They all have political futures, careers, jobs, lives to think about. And I don't think they'll want to be associated with him. So, we were worried about a lot of things going into this election cycle. Very fortunately, most of them have not come to pass. And I think that, as I said, this is the best we could have hoped for given all the circumstances of COVID and all the other things that are happening right now.
And what do you say to the argument, which I've heard a lot, and this has been featuring some of my reporting as well, which is that actually Trump tapped into something which is astonishingly powerful and has a great deal of support in the United States, as the numbers bear out. But he wasn't particularly competent or good at it. And is the concern, as Paul said earlier, that we actually get a far more competent and effective figure in the wake of Trump, or offer in the wake of Trump, which more effectively embodies and articulates and mobilizes a lot of Trumpism. Do you see that, and what do you think the response to that needs to be?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think that there had always been a growing divide between the Republican elite and then the Republican base. And the reason that the party focuses so much on culture issues in elections is because the Republican elite does not agree with its base on economic issues. Its base supports much more democratic ideas. When I say democratic, I mean big D democratic, in terms of people want higher wages, people want Medicaid, people want Social Security, people want to be able to live good lives. And I think there is a tremendous possibility for a more competent version of Trump. I think Protect Democracy as an organization has been worried about Trump 2.0 from the beginning, which is why we've helped with these legislative reforms of trying to make sure there are guardrails around the presidency. Congress is supposed to be the Article I branch, doesn't act like it. The executive branch has grown in its power over time. And I think there's a rebalancing the three branches of government, Congress, courts, and they don't behave that way right now. And so what you end up outside executive, incompetent Congress, and then courts that are left to be much more political than they're not just deciding matters of law, but really weighing in on policy. And in that way, there's definitely a rebalancing that needs to happen. I think that passing legislative reforms to constrain the power of the president means that even if you had a more competent kind of version of Trump, a more populist, like the same type of version of Trump, but someone who's more competent, they would be constrained in what they're able to do and the havoc they're able to wreak. But I think also you're seeing rise of populism on the left as well. It's not just on the right, and something being populist doesn't mean that it's bad. A lot of people supporting something is sort of meant to be democracy. I think the challenge is when you talk about the phrase liberal democracy, liberal implies that individual rights are protected and democracy implies majoritarian will. We don't have either right now. So that's sort of a problem, right? We don't have individual rights protected and we live under minority rule. Our government doesn't represent the majority of the will of the voters. And so I think there are reforms that are legal and structural that can help with the democracy piece of it to make sure our country is more small d democratic and making sure that the will of the majority of voters is heard. And similarly on individual rights, there are things that can be done. But I think what you're seeing from a lot of Trump voters, people who've had power and had their individual rights protected, is like they're not particularly worried about that. And so they are drawn towards a more authoritarian form of government. Whereas I think on the left, people are more thoughtful about individual rights, but they still are kind of pushing for more populist ideas. And I think you could really see a remaking of coalitions and of parties in the country in the coming years. And I'm very interested to see what that looks like, and hopefully to help have a role in making sure it stays small d democratic.
Thank you. More power to you. We'll all be following your work. Very last comments from Paul and then from Mona. What do you see happening over the next few days and weeks and going forward? Just very quick wrap up answers from both.
Okay, so I'm pleased, I'm heartened that there was no serious attempt to disrupt the voting. I think that was on the agenda of the Proud Boys and militias, and it didn't happen. I'm pleased that over the last two nights, there haven't been major provocational attempts to stop the voting. We're still at the level of people in suits, aren't we, with their little subpoenas and a few people outside. As it becomes clear and Biden is declared, I think there will be a moment where I'm certain that the alt-right will mobilize. And I think we can see in Philly, for example, I've seen in Philly today, people mobilizing a lot to defend, as it were, democracy. I think if there's a serious attempt at a coup, a serious attempt by Trump to stay in post, ignore the transition, carry on the legal fight, and he actually starts saying, come to the streets. There are two things. There has to be mass mobilization. We don't want the DSA and AOC on the streets. We need Biden on the streets and Kamala Harris and all the lawyers that we need to them. The other thing is, as black activists once always said, the masters can't pick the cotton. A general strike is the way that all serious coups that were defeated in European history in the 20th century, that's how they were defeated. The Kapp push in Germany in 1920, general strike. And I know it's on the agenda and it sounds weird, but if Trump tries it, it's organized labor are going to have to play a part.
Thank you. Yes, I'm just headed to Philadelphia now, so I might be witnessing the beginnings of that general strike this evening, and I'll be reporting back to all of you on Twitter from my social media bubble about that. So do follow me. And Mona, from your perspective, the next few days, the next few weeks, and what next?
Well, I was on a podcast earlier in which we were constantly asked, so let's end on good news, let's end on cheery news. And I think this determination to be cheerful all the time is really dangerous, because there isn't a lot to celebrate for all the things that we've spent, the past hour talking about. But what there is that has happened and that I hold on to as we move forward are victories. For example, Sarah McBride as the first trans senator who was elected by Delaware, several Black and people of color who are LGBTQ elected across the countries, a queer Muslim woman in Oklahoma who was elected. So I'm looking at all these newly elected people who have not existed in these spaces that were never created for them. And you know that they're going to go into those spaces and disrupt and shake them up, because that's what we need. Because it is the younger, it is towards the left, the more progressive, the less powerful parts of the now I'm a registered independent because I have very little faith in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, as far as I'm concerned, is cowardly and spineless. But these younger, newly elected members give me hope, because they are the ones who are saying this is what we represent. And this is what I'm looking at as we move forward now. Joe Biden, for me, represented how little the Democrats represent. And I think Paul mentioned that at the beginning of our conversation. All they represented was, we have to get rid of Trump. And then what? What do you actually stand for? So a lot of these younger, newly elected representatives tell us what they stand for. That I'm holding on to. But ultimately, what I'm going to hold on to as we move forward is we have to destroy patriarchy. All of this is about patriarchy. This, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, whether we're talking about impoverished people, whether we're talking about imprisoned people, whether we're talking about women, trans rights, all of this, class rights, ableism, all of it. And so I've been telling people on my Twitter, on my social media, unless you are an able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual, white, conservative man, and you're wealthy on top of that, this election should worry you. And anyone who voted for Trump, who is none of those things, either wants to be those things or benefits from someone who is those things, wishes to be those things, or wants adjacency to those things. Because that's the hierarchy of the United States of America. And that hierarchy will be destroyed by destroying patriarchy. So as I said, before, during, and after elections, my declaration of faith is fuck the patriarchy. And that is what I will be doing every day.
Thank you very much, Mona, and thank you to all the guests. I think I'll just end here. I'll try also ending on a note of hope that isn't false, but we've been traveling across the country, and I've been spending a lot of time with a new generation of civic and political leaders. There's a podcast which Julian just put in the chat, which tells the story of the new generation of leaders that are rising, that are occupying cities like Louisville, Kentucky, and have been for months, every single day. And I think getting to know them and hearing their stories and hearing their perspectives is one of the things we can all do now as we watch the circus unfold. So do follow the Our Economy podcast. Thank you all so much for joining us. Really excellent discussion. And next week we'll be back picking up many of these themes at exactly the same time. Thank you to Aditi, to Paul, to Mona. Stay safe, all of you. Be well and stay tuned. Bye-bye.